All right, so we've got a few people trickling in. Welcome everyone to our webinar on how it happens here, what to know, and how to help children experiencing domestic violence. A quick introduction and some quick housekeeping before we get started. Our main panelists today are Anne Rodwell-Lawton from the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, Georgette Harrison from the Child Guidance Center of Southern Connecticut, and Captain Robert Cipolla with the Wilton Police Department. I'm Trinity Haswell, the Wilton Youth Services Coordinator. For those that don't know me, I will be doing the housekeeping and general things. Also, just as a note, we do have a Q&A box and a regular chat box, so feel free to place questions in either box, and we will have about 15 minutes at the end to address any questions. And now I'll pass it over to Anne to get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Trinity. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and really excited that we were able to partner with so many agencies to bring you this program today. We have a lot to cover, so we're going to dive in. But before we do, I just want to acknowledge that the content today might be overwhelming for folks. We will be talking about a sensitive topic, so please take care of yourself during this time or afterwards. So today we're going to start by talking about domestic violence, some statistics around children in domestic violence, how children are exposed, and then Georgette will be talking about how to identify children who are experiencing domestic violence, resiliency, and we will then wrap up by talking about resources and how to help children. So to get started, to give us some context to what we're talking about, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men in the United States have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. So this is a really high prevalence, and we know that everyone knows someone who's been impacted in some way by domestic violence, and this impacts every single community. We also know that domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. When we look at the prevalence of domestic violence and children being exposed, 1 in 15 children in the United States are exposed to intimate partner violence. And we also know that there are long-term impacts on children's physical and mental health. And Georgette will go into that in more depth. And finally, we also know that growing up in a home where domestic violence is present is the strongest predictor of a child becoming either a perpetrator or a victim of domestic violence later in life. So this means that children growing up in these homes are more likely to be abuser or victims later on in life, but that doesn't mean they always will. And so Georgette will be talking about resilience with our children and recognizing that we can stop this generational cycle of abuse. So what is domestic violence? When we're using this terminology, it's helpful to understand what domestic violence is versus some other terms that we might use, like intimate partner violence. Domestic violence is a broad term, kind of an umbrella term to talk about acts of violence between family members or household members. So this could be between a parent and a child. This could be 2 adults. It could be dating partners. It could be a caretaker and an elderly individual. And then within that, we have intimate partner violence, which is talking about that violence between 2 people who are intimate partners. Teen dating violence also falls under that. So kind of the difference in the terminology is around the relationship between the 2 people involved. We sometimes use domestic violence and intimate partner violence interchangeably. But domestic violence refers to a pattern of abusive behaviors where one person maintains power and control. So it's really important for us to remember that we are not talking about a single isolated incident that children are exposed to. We're talking about a pattern of behaviors that often escalates over time. And we know that abuse is rooted in power and control. And so it's not based in anger. Sometimes abusers use anger in order to have control in their relationship, but really abuse is rooted in having power and control over another individual. And then finally, it's important for us to recognize that we are not just talking about physical abuse, and abuse can take many different forms. And so that could be verbal, emotional, physical, financial, technological, or sexual in nature. Okay, so where do children come into this, and how are they part of this dynamic? Well, we know that abusers use children to control victims in order to get victims to do what they want. And so children are a major part of this dynamic and are used to have power and control in those relationships. So here are just a few examples. And it's really important to note that these dynamics and how children are used for control happens even after abusive relationships have ended, because many victims have to co-parent with their abuser and have to figure out these dynamics moving forward. So even if this relationship has ended, possibly they are still being harassed during visitation for the children. The children are being used to relay messages, and that's really confusing for them to understand. And then we also have threats. Abusers often will threaten victims and survivors around taking the children away. And so saying, if you leave, I'm going to hurt the children, or if you leave, I'm going to take the children. And so those threats are very real for folks. And how are children exposed to domestic violence? When we think about domestic violence in children, we probably think of something like this picture on the screen of there being a verbal fight or possibly physical abuse taking place, and children witnessing and being present for that abuse. But it's really important that we recognize that children are exposed in many other ways, and they're going to be impacted by that even if they don't see physical violence happening. So children can feel tension building in the home prior to an assault. But at the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, what we really see a lot with children is they are being exposed because they're seeing the aftermath of a violent incident. So maybe they were asleep when this happened, but when they wake up in the morning, they see physical injuries to some of the parties involved, or they see destruction of property. And so they're being exposed by seeing that aftermath of what happened. Sometimes children can be denied care because a parent is injured or depressed. We know that domestic violence interferes with both parents' ability to parent to some degree. Sometimes that can go to the level of neglecting some of their basic needs, maybe around medical care or making sure children are going to school. And then finally, children are exposed by having their relationship with the nonviolent parent undermined, being asked to take sides or being told negative messages about the other parent. And so hopefully with all of this, we recognize that children are part of this dynamic. They are often actively trying to understand what is going on around them. And Georgette is going to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Anne. So, as Anne and I were talking about the impact of domestic violence on children, we started to talk about how it's difficult to have a conversation about the impact if we don't fully sort of acknowledge that the things that are happening in the home are happening between attachment figures, the most important people in a child's life. So we wanted to spend a tiny bit of time just really talking about attachments, right? For those who may not be as familiar with the term. And it's really a psychological model that studies the physiological, emotional, and the behavioral interactions that happen between a child and their caregiver. right? And that each person brings something to the relationship, right? Parents bring their own history with relationships, their own trauma history as well, their own images and fantasies about who they wanted to be as parents. And children also bring something to the relationship. Children's personality, their temperament, any medical issues that they might have, the ways in which sort of they view the world, they all bring this into this relationship. And we know, we used to think that attachment, these behaviors that keep children and parents connected, existed in the service of survival. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that that's actually not its primary function. And it's really about helping a child develop a sense of safety and security within their world, particularly when they're little, when they feel very defenseless, out of control, and they don't have a lot of power. Really, they rely on their big people to keep them safe. And so the attachment figure really serves as this sort of safe base for exploration. Their ability to go out and do the things that they should be doing in childhood is really based on their ability to know that their home base, their parents, their attachment figures are safe. And so what constitutes a safe attachment figure? Typically, we think about it in terms of caregivers who are predictable, where a child really has a sense that when I'm with my parents, I can kind of predict, I know how they typically react. Even if they're sort of unpredictable in the way that they react, but at least that's even predictable. But if you don't really know what parents you're going to get on any given day, that's very anxiety provoking for a child. Another characteristic of a safe attachment figure is they're responsive, right? They're able to respond to a child in a way that makes a child feel, if something happens to me, if I'm hurt, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm hungry, I'm sleepy, whatever it is, any need that I have, I know that my parents will take care of me. Typically, we also think of safe attachment figures as being warm or nurturing, right? This is not to say that all parents need to be sort of warm and fuzzy, right? There are very warm and nurturing parents that don't present that way. It's really about helping the child develop this sense that I know, I can feel it in my bones, that my parents care about me. They care about what I need, and they care about how I'm feeling. A caregiver's responses are also accurate and sensitive, right? A child has a sense that, my parents can tell when something's up with me. They're curious or noticing that something has shifted within me. Even at times when maybe I might even be too young or too confused by my own feelings to really be able to even have the words to describe it. But they've noticed something's up. And they can help me feel better without overwhelming me. And above all, and this is the one thing that we want to keep in mind with attachment figures, is that attachment figures need to be protective, right? I, as a child, don't have to worry about anything. I can go out and explore, do my thing, because I know that my parents are around to keep me safe. So when you think about that, without that safe attachment figure, this normative child development, the things of childhood that we want kids to engage in. We want them to go to school. We want them to play. We want them to develop friendships. We want them to be able to learn things in school. All these things that should happen while a child is growing up, they can't happen if they don't have a safe home base. And so let's really think about the impact of not having that safe home base. What does that do to children, right? So instead of having a safe, predictable attachment figure, a child might perceive a caregiver as being very scary, frightening, or threatening, right? Usually the person in the relationship who is being aggressive is being perceived as, being really scary and frightening. And the younger the child is, the more overwhelmed they become by seeing these acts of aggression and control in the home. Alternatively, the child might perceive the caregiver as passive or as weak, and that they're unable to protect me as a child. They also, because we know that the dynamics of how in the home when there's domestic violence can also sort of shift on a dime, and you might have a caregiver who is seen as both aggressive one moment and sort of despondent in the next. That becomes sort of, a caregiver who's perceived as just being very unpredictable, right? Initially, when I talked about that predictability, that's a caregiver where a child doesn't know who they're going to get at any given moment. So in all of these moments, right? Because what children learn about themselves, about the world, about other people, these things are taught over time. They're taught over small moments. And so children learn that, maybe this is my fault. Maybe my parents are arguing because I'm not a good kid. I didn't do my homework. I once heard a kid tell me that, they started arguing because I didn't eat my peas. And so I have to make sure to eat my peas so that they don't fight. They also end up feeling like I have to protect my caregiver. I have my mom or my dad, they can't do this on their own. They seem to always be sad. And so I can't bother them with something that I might need. I have to figure this out on my own. They end up being confused. They can't sort of make sense of how can I both love my parent and be afraid of them at the same time. How do I reconcile these two feelings? Other kids, they might, for the sake of survival, say, I just need to be as in the background as I can. I need to fly under the radar. I'm just hoping that people will even forget that I'm here. Other kids also learn that, this is how powerful people act. This is how I keep myself from being small and vulnerable. I need to be big and loud and scary in order to stay safe so that people won't hurt me. They might also learn, people do some really, really scary things when they're angry or they're sad. And so these big feelings, they're really dangerous. I have to avoid them. And I have to be scared of people who express them. Other times they also learn that, I can't trust my feelings. That something in here is going wrong, right? Because why is no one doing anything about what's going on in here, right? Or these are the people who love me and protect me parts of the time, and now they're acting in this way, and maybe this is just the way it is, but it feels wrong, but maybe I'm the one who's wrong. But most importantly, what they're learning is that this is what relationships look like, right? Because why would the parent that's supposed to love me and protect me, why do they act in these ways? Maybe this is just what this looks like. I don't know. Maybe this is exactly what happens at my neighbor's house. I'm afraid that maybe it's not, so I'm not going to find out. I'm not going to tell anyone. But maybe this is just what things look like. Maybe this is what love looks like. So the one thing that we, I know that a lot of you work with children, and one of the questions that always comes up is, how do I know? How do I know that this is happening in a child's home? And the one thing that we want to make sure that we emphasize is that every child will present differently, right? Out of all that list that I just gave you of things that kids know, each one of those things that that child is learning will cause them to react in a different way. And so we don't have like a single quote unquote profile of what a child who's exposed to domestic violence might look like. But these are definitely some behaviors that you want to look out for. So parentified behavior, the child who seems to have that role reversed with the parent, they're taking care of the parent. If they get a bad grade, they're not so worried about what might happen when they take the bad grade home. They're actually worried about, they don't want to bother their parents. You might also see more aggressive behavior with peers, with other grown-ups within the school, in the playground. You might also see extreme perfectionistic behavior, right? The child who might start sobbing because they got an A- as opposed to an A. Or when they start to struggle, maybe with something at school, they get so overwhelmed. And that's that kid that feels like, maybe if I just either fly under the radar, people will forget about me. And if I struggle, I'm not going to fly under the radar. Or, if I were just a good kid, my parents wouldn't fight. They develop this as sort of a coping mechanism. And now, if you're worried about what might be going on at home when you're at school, how likely are you to be able to concentrate on anything, right? In trauma work, we talk about, how can we ask a child to concentrate when their brain is on fire, right? These are the kids that can't focus on anything else because they're wondering what's going on at home. And so you might also see some school avoidance. I don't want to leave my home. Sometimes I might even act as the mediator between my parents. And if I go, I don't know what I'm coming home to. So I'm just going to stay here. I'm going to say that I have a tummy ache. I'm going to say that, I can't get out of bed, whatever it is. And sometimes it even develops into, medical issues, but they seem to have no organic or medical cause. What we know is kids aren't going to school. They become more isolated from peers because, they feel like no one might understand what might be going on in the home. They might feel shame. They might feel guilt. And so they isolate. They're going to have difficulties trusting others, right? Again, what I've learned from very early on in my life is that, big people act in really scary ways. And so I don't know that I can trust big people, even if it's not my parents. They're going to have more difficulties with emotional regulation, right? So they might sort of go from 0 to 60 very quickly, or they might numb completely, right? The kids that say like, big feelings have to be avoided at all costs because either you get really angry or really sad and can't function. These feelings are just to be avoided at all costs. And then, many, especially with the more severe cases, many go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And they're much more likely also to repeat that relationship pattern. Unless we can help them, first of all, say like this, we have to help your parents because this, I'm sure this is not what they wanted for you. But it's also it's not good. This is not good for anyone involved. And this is most definitely not what a healthy relationship looks like. So, there is also a place for us to really think about resiliency as well, right? And that's really the ability to successfully adapt the stressors, right? Being able to maintain psychological well-being even in the face of adversity. This idea of being able to bounce back from a setback, right? And it's not really something that someone has or doesn't have, but really sort of this interaction between risk factors and protective factors. Resilience really, like the pictures that are here, resilience is really about when this huge storm comes, can you be flexible? Can you adapt? Or are you just going to be completely uprooted? So I was hoping that people would put in the chat what you think is the most common factor in research for children who exhibit resilience. What do you think is the one thing that kids that say, I think I can adapt pretty well to a setback? What do you think is the most common factor amongst those children? Don't be shy, put it in the chat. There's no wrong answers. Okay. So we have go ahead, Trinity.
Yeah, we have one answer coming in, a caring and supportive adult. An adult that is safe. Support from one of the parents, feeling that one adult or parent loves them.
Yeah, that is actually absolutely right. It is having the presence of one person. You just need one person that you feel cares about you. That is what, and ideally it's the caregivers, but sometimes that's not going to be it. And I think that's where every single person in this room today can make a difference in whatever capacity you have in that child's life. Could be a teacher, could be a mentor, it could be a coach. We all have a part to play in being able to build a child's resilience, that despite all the risk factors, we can really counteract that by, first of all, supporting the parents, but then also being that trusted, safe, predictable caregiver, because a child can have multiple attachments. Now, that being said, there's no place like home. For those who actually read The Wizard of Oz, this is an excerpt from the story, right? And Dorothy is telling the Scarecrow all about Kansas. Everything is gray. The cyclone carried her there, and in the beginning of the book, she's talking about how, everyone really is suffering, right? This is not a great place to be. And the Scarecrow listens to her and says, I don't understand why you would wish to leave this beautiful country of Oz and go back to this dry, gray place you call Kansas. And Dorothy says, well, because no matter how dreary and gray our homes are, we would rather live there than in any other country, be it ever so beautiful, because there's no place like home. This is where we also have to come in. It's good, right? It's protective to have another caring, supportive, predictable adult in a child's life. But if we can also help the parents regain that spot, we will make a bigger difference in a child's life. And so oftentimes, yes, we can step in as those attachment figures for a little bit, but it can't be at the expense of really the support that the parents need, because that is who the child wants, ultimately. Next slide. So one of the things that we also want to think about is prevention, right? Even for the kids who have not been exposed to domestic violence in the home, we want to make sure that we're having these conversations about healthy relationships really early on. And it's not a one and done conversation, because we know that according to the CDC, 1 in 10 high school students has been purposefully hit, slapped, or physically hurt by a romantic partner. 1 in 10. And so we need to normalize these conversations and find these sort of opportunities for parents to have these conversations, but then also as providers, as teachers, as coaches, as mentors, to have these conversations, find those informal opportunities so that we can talk about examples of healthy and unhealthy relationships, define digital abuse, help them explore their own boundaries so that they're not having to set them when they're being, when they feel like someone is transgressing against them. And looking for signs of an unhealthy relationship and not being afraid to ask someone else about, you know, this doesn't feel right, but what do you think? So Anne is going to talk to us a little bit more also about Dvcc's Parent Resource Guide.
Thank you, Georgette. So prevention is really important. And like Georgette said, trying to weave into our informal conversations with children what healthy relationships look like, because those skills aren't innate. And so we need to teach children those skills in addition to teaching children to be able to recognize those unhealthy behaviors. So during the Q&A portion, when I'm not sharing my screen, I will put a parent resource guide in the chat that Dvcc has created that talks about all these things on this slide about what healthy relationships look like, about how to talk about boundaries with children. It also has some conversation starters and also talks about some of those warning signs and unhealthy relationship dynamics, particularly for teenagers. So be on the lookout for that. So now we are going to talk about how to talk to children and how to break the silence. For many adults, whether you are a provider or a concerned friend, adults say, oh, I'm not sure if I want to talk about this because I don't want to say something wrong and cause more harm, or I'm not sure if the child even knows what's happening, right? So I'm just going to assume that they don't really know, or I just don't know what to say. However, when we continue to be silent about this, that sends a message to children. It sends a message to children that they should be silent about what's happening, that there is shame around what's happening. And like Georgette said, it makes them second guess their own thoughts and abilities, second guess, what am I doing wrong? Am I not understanding what's happening right now? So it is really important that we break silence around this issue and talk with children about what's happening. Now, you can see a lot of these examples directly relate to what Georgette was saying about what children learn from being exposed. And so one of the things we want to focus on is letting them know that that behavior is not okay. And so we want to be clear about that. That violent behavior is not how we treat other people. It's not okay. But we want to make sure we're focusing on the behavior and not the person, right? So we're not saying that this person is bad. We're saying that their behavior is not okay. We also want to be really clear that this is not their fault. We also want to be really clear that it's not their job or responsibility to change the situation. Georgette was talking about how children often try to protect one of their caregivers, right? And so letting them know that's not their job. We also want to open the conversation and ask them how they're feeling, because children have really complex mixed feelings, like Georgette was talking about. It's really confusing to a child to understand that they love someone that they know is causing harm. We also see a lot of children who are very angry at the caring, nonviolent parent, viewing that parent as weak or passive, or why is this parent allowing this to happen to themselves? Right. So just having them identify and talk about how they're feeling, and saying that all of those feelings are okay. We want to say that we care about them. And again, it's the job of adults to keep kids safe. Now, a few other things to keep in mind when talking to children: we really want to follow their lead. And so we want to ask them about what they know or what they are thinking, and then provide them a space to ask us questions that they have. And children will typically stop asking questions when they feel like they have enough information to understand the situation. And so we really don't want to give more information than a child needs or wants. It's also important to remember that giving children the opportunity to talk openly about what they know and ask questions is often more effective and more productive than a child hearing details from an adult's perspective. Again, so that's why we really want to follow their lead. And these other bullet points: validating their feelings, explaining that it's not their fault, and talking about how the violence is not okay. Those are all things that we talked about on the previous slide. So we also want to talk about how to help parents, right? Because when we help and support parents, we therefore help and support children. And so how can we start this conversation when we're really not 100% sure about what's happening? We can start by talking about healthy relationships and talking about what we all deserve in relationships, right? And what their rights are. So instead of focusing on the red flag behaviors, we could possibly talk about, well, every relationship should have this, or this is what a healthy relationship looks like. And that can really start the conversation without kind of pointing fingers, and allows them to think about what those healthy relationships look like and compare it to their own relationship. However, we can identify and discuss some of the warning signs that we might be seeing with how children are acting and behaving, but also the warning signs that we might see in between the parents as well. And so identifying what we know or what we've seen can be a good starting point. And then we also want to decrease isolation. We know that victims and their children are often isolated from their support systems, cut off from friends and family. And so any way that we can connect these parents to a community, to others, connecting the children to other children is really helpful to decrease that isolation. And if you're a provider, that can also just be making sure you're routinely checking in with these families to know that they're not alone and you're there to help and support them. So what might this sound like? It might sound like you and the children deserve to be respected and to feel safe. Right? Everyone deserves to feel safe emotionally and physically, and that can kind of start the conversation. Or we can identify some of those behaviors that we've seen. So I've noticed that Kyle has been acting aggressively towards others and has talked about mom and dad fighting. How are things going at home? And then what do we do when we have someone disclose, a parent disclose, that they are experiencing domestic violence? They are a victim or survivor of domestic violence. We want to help and support them, right? Because by doing that, we are helping and supporting their children. Now, something that's really important to keep in mind when helping and supporting victims is that leaving an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time for both the victim and the children. And so we really want to be careful about just telling folks, well, you got to leave this relationship. You have to end it. Because if they are not connected to a resource, if they are not connected to someone like a domestic violence advocate who is safety planning around this time, where we know there's increased lethality, we might actually be putting this person and their children in more harm's way. And so we want to really make sure this family is connected to resources and possibly a domestic violence advocate. We also know that it takes on average 7 times before a victim leaves permanently. So we need to be supportive throughout that process. Now, I like this chart because it shows kind of the tactic that's used, the impact on victims, and then how that then is going to impact how we respond and how we help them. So the first thing we want to do is discuss referrals, and we're going to talk about what those referrals and resources look like, and also discuss what support systems they currently have. Many times they feel like they have no inner resources due to emotional abuse. So we want to validate their feelings, just like we are with children, validating their feelings, pointing out their strengths. We also want to discuss the dynamics of domestic violence and reiterate that they're not at fault, right? And they're not to blame for what's going on. Again, we would do that with children in an age-appropriate way. And finally, we want to refer to possibly domestic violence crisis center or another domestic violence agency to help safety plan. Because when we're safety planning with parents, we're also talking about safety plans for the children as well. Children are often part of safety plans. And we also want to give power and control back to survivors. And so survivors are experts in their lives. They understand the risks and rewards of different options that are available to them. They know their family and those dynamics and their children better than anyone. So we want to let them know about all of their options and follow their lead in what they think might be best for them and their family. Okay, now we are going to have Captain Cipolla talk about law enforcement role and response, particularly around when they are responding to crimes where there are children. So take it away, Captain Cipolla.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Georgette. Great job so far in the presentation. And, you know, I'm here to talk about, law enforcement response and our role, important role as law enforcement officers when we do respond to a family violence call. But as the program states, it happens here. And, for the better part of a decade, I've been involved as the department's domestic violence liaison and part of our Wilton domestic violence task force, and doing these discussions and having conversations throughout town. And it always comes back to, does it really happen here? Does it happen in Wilton? And sadly to say, yes, it does. And aside from our rudimentary calls for service, our daily traffic enforcement, motor vehicle crash response, domestic related incidences is one of the more frequent calls for service that our officers respond to on a yearly basis. And what this is depicting here, these respective pie charts are years from 2008 and year to date through 2021. These are the pie charts represent the total family violence calls for those respective years. One point of clarification I want to make is when we talk about domestic violence, certainly we know it can manifest itself in many ways, as Anne has touched on, the emotional abuse, the use of technology, abuse, financial abuse. When we speak of family violence from a police perspective, there's a very specific statutory definition in terms of when we have the ability to hold offenders accountable through our powers of arrest. And that means that there has to be some kind of act of physical violence, bodily injury, the threat thereof, or instances of stalking type investigations. Now, You can see year to year, we hover around, between 30 and 40 family violence calls for service. But I will tell you, we're generally between 80 to 100 calls for service that are domestic in nature. So those could just be instances of verbal abuse taking place. Doesn't reach the statutory limit of family violence, where we then have probable cause to make an arrest. But so these numbers are much greater in terms of the overall sense and our response to calls that are domestic in nature. But so getting back to the charts that you see before you, the red indicates the percentage of these family violence calls year to year that there were children present at these family violence incidents. So again, calls for service, whether there's been violence, the threat thereof, bodily injury, or a stalking type investigation, the red percentages represented in these pie charts are calls for service where children were present for these acts. So you can see, there is children often are present and they are witnessing these acts of violence amongst, perhaps parents, and it could run the gamut in terms of other household members as well. What I do say is, as police, we respond to a myriad of different types of calls for service day to day. Domestic violence calls is probably the most important work we do because it's unique, it's complex, it involves people who are familiar with each other, and it has lasting impacts on families and children. Go to the next slide. So what's our role? This was some research done by the Yale Medicine Child Study Center. So certainly, as police, when we respond to an instance of family violence, we can create a safe environment to help children reestablish a sense of security and stability. Really, that's our job as police. Yes, we are law enforcement, we enforce laws, but first and foremost, we show up to chaotic situations frequently, and a family violence situation, when there's a lot of emotions, they can be some of the more chaotic scenes that we respond to. Our job is to bring calm to that incident, to restore that sense of safety and security for everyone involved, and in particular children when they're present. We play an important role in helping the child and the families get on that road to recovery, to hopefully heal and thrive. As police, obviously, we're looked at as a protective factor. We are one cog in the wheel. Obviously, you've heard from Anne and Georgette today in terms of other resources that are there to hopefully have sustained recovery and healing when someone's been exposed to violence. As police, though, we're in a unique position when we respond to these emergent calls for service. Again, as Anne stated, domestic violence is very fluid. It's not an isolated incident. It's a pattern of behaviors over a period of time. Very underreported. At the moment in time that now we as the police have been called to respond, we know we're not responding to just this one-off incident. It just got so bad in that particular incident that they felt like the police needed to respond. So we are in a unique position at that point in time, in that acute environment, to one, recognize children that have been exposed to violence, identify those children that may have been traumatized, to obviously overwhelming events for adults, and do that for a child who obviously the brain's not fully developed, doesn't understand exactly what's happening. So recognize, identify, and then refer to appropriate resources. And you've heard of some of the resources, and some of them will be expanded on once I wrap up here. But that's the ultimate goal, is install a sense of security and safety, but then also provide the resources and warm referrals to agencies like the Domestic Violence Crisis Center that can hopefully aid in that overall recovery. And then lastly, children's attitudes towards police can be shaped in the moment when we're there for something very overwhelming to them. ultimately our job as police is to be looked at as that helpful and trusting relationship. Building community trust obviously happens one interaction at a time. And this is a moment in time where, in restoring that sense of safety and security and helping that family try to heal, we can build that trust. And when dealing with children, and particularly in this type of scenario, we want to replace what sometimes can be more of an impersonal standard approach to something in our day-to-day job with a more close-up, personal, meaningful discussion and relationship building with that child, so that they do see us as that helpful, useful, protective relationship going forward. And quite frankly, again, just to go back to, as police, certainly one of the more important calls for service and one of the most important work that we will do in responding to family violence incidences. And we talk about the trauma that obviously it has on its survivors, the families, the children. While police can have, kind of this, flat, gruff appearance at times, when they respond to these calls and they see how it impacts the families and the children in particular, that's not something they forget. They take that home with them when they finish their shift and they go about their career. When they have these tools like the Domestic Violence Crisis Center, Georgette's agency, and a lot of our local resources to be able to refer to, and to know that they're just not responding, perhaps making an arrest and leaving, but they can give resources. The officer, from an officer wellness perspective, they feel more effective in their job. They feel more satisfied with what they were able to do for that family or, that child.
Okay, thank you so much, Captain Cipolla. This is a great segue into resources and what is available to help and support children and their families. We are really lucky in Lower Fairfield County. There are so many amazing resources that are often free to help and support families. So Georgette is going to talk a little bit about Child Guidance Center of Southern Connecticut.
So I know that Trinity also is going to share a wide range of resources for your particular area. Just know, there's several child guidance centers around the state. So if you're not from Wilton, you're from somewhere else, there is a child guidance center near you. But for those who might be joining in from Greenwich, Stamford, Darien, or New Canaan, we would be the Child Guidance Center that's in your area. And this is the contact information for you. We also want to highlight that every area in the state also has what's called a Child Advocacy Center. And a Child Advocacy Center is a child-friendly environment where children who have experienced sexual abuse, severe physical violence, or abuse and neglect, domestic minor sex trafficking, or if they've been witness to violence, which is the case in the reason why I'm mentioning it here. The CAC is a place where they can be interviewed for forensic purposes by someone who is a trained forensic evaluator, and they work jointly with law enforcement and with Child Protective Services. For Wilton in particular, the CAC is housed under the umbrella of the Human Services Council, and it's housed under the under Children's Connection. The CAC in Stamford is housed under Child Guidance Center, and the way that really the goal is to help a child really only tell their story once, and then help the family connect with needed mental health services, forensic medical, and advocacy.
Great, thank you. I also just want to spend a minute talking about the Domestic Violence Crisis Center and what our services look like. We provide free and confidential services to both adults, children, and teens. We have a dedicated youth and family counselor who works with children, doing education, age-appropriate education around these dynamics of domestic violence, safety planning, helping identify coping skills. But our agency really does a lot of work with both Child Guidance of Southern Connecticut and Mid-Fairfield County, doing those referrals for children who are identified to have some mental health needs and in need of more support. So our agency does individual counseling with adults. We have safe housing, legal advocacy, and so please don't hesitate to reach out if you are in need of support. And Trinity, do you want to share those other resources we have for people and then go into our questions?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. So for everyone in the chat, there will be a list of more local resources and other services for you to look into if you are in need. So please feel free to download this. Hopefully I can put it in the chat. Forgive me, it's not going in. But what I can do is for the recording that will be posted, perhaps we can somehow attach the file with the resources where the recording is also posted on the Wilton Youth Services website, and also Wilton Youth Council should be posting it as well. And they, for those of you that would like to take a few minutes, we do have a program evaluation that you could fill out perhaps while we're doing some questions. And I know we're short on time, so I will get started on the questions. All right, so this one may be best answered by Georgette. As mentioned, how there is no place like home, how does one create a buffer that can take place in the home so that the impact is not as harsh?
You mean, okay. We probably can't ask the attendee what they mean in terms of a buffer in the home. I mean, I think when we find out that a child has been exposed to domestic violence, one of the main protective factors is really seeing the child, seeing that all the grown-ups around them are sort of coming together. They're on the same page about, you know, this isn't about, you know, people being bad. This isn't about trying to find blame. This is really about trying to find help. And that they need to see that the grown-ups in their life are being supported. They need to have a mental health professional really help them make meaning, right? Understand all of the things that Anne and I have talked about, that it wasn't their fault, that it's, there was nothing that they could have done or not done to make this go away. But also as providers outside is really having a good outlet for that child to return to childhood, right? Having that social network and connecting them with either an after-school activity, something that can take them also out of the situation where they can feel like a child again, can also be really protective.
Nice, thank you for that answer. Moving on, how would we address what a healthy relationship looks like when it may be their culture, maybe within their culture, to behave a certain way that is seen as unhealthy?
I'll start and people can join in. I think an easy way to talk about healthy relationships is talking about how it makes children and teens feel, right? Do you feel safe in that relationship? Does that relationship make you feel happy? Do you feel respected in that relationship? And like you can say, how you feel, and there aren't going to be repercussions, whether that's a friendship or a dating relationship. And so that's how I would go about it and talk about relationships. You're absolutely correct. Culture does impact how we view relationships.
Nice. This may be for Captain Cipolla. Since the pandemic, has there been more rates of domestic violence in the home?
So surprisingly, what we saw, and I don't think it was unique to a lot of police agencies around us, is that in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, we actually saw our family violence response rates drop. And now that means that the police weren't getting calls for service, and Anne may have a different experience in terms of calls that they were getting on their respective hotlines for services. But in 2020, we did see them drop, and that could have been for a myriad of reasons. We were in a situation where we were sheltering in place, staying at home, and survivors are then staying at home with their offenders, and calling the police may not be seen to them as a safe opportunity to do that, because where what are the options after that if the offender then comes back in the house? So I don't have that's just anecdotal. What I will say, in 2021, in the new year, we did see a spike in a year-to-year comparison in terms of our family violence responses, but over the course of this year, it has evened back out in terms of what we typically see year to year.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add that at Dvcc, what we saw was 140% increase in the amount of advocacy and support services that our clients need. So we were seeing clients more frequently, and they were in need of more support as a response to COVID. And additionally, the length of stay in our safe houses tripled with COVID.
Okay, thank you. Why is it common for victims to return back to their abuser?
Well, we could talk for an hour about those dynamics. I would say it comes down to loving this individual, having hope that this individual will change, believing when they say that they're going to make changes and change their behavior. Yeah, I think loving this person and having hope that they will change are some ones at the top of the list.
And just to add, I mean, Anne has said it beautifully in the past. The person experiencing the abuse doesn't necessarily want to leave their offender. They just want the abuse to stop. And that's why these, calls for service are so complex, because again, they're people that have long withstanding relationships and care about each other despite the abuse that is occurring. They just want the abuse to stop. They still love perhaps the offender and care about that person. It's just they want the abuse to stop.
And I can tell you from like a child counselor perspective, I oftentimes hear parents saying, I don't want my child to grow up without, whoever the person is. They themselves might have grown up in a single family or a single parent home, and they feel very much the loss of that. And they feel like they don't want to do that for their child, or they worry about, if I don't stay with this person, how am I going to take care of my child? Right? I might not have the resources to be able to do it. And so it's, but more often than not, it's really feeling like they don't want that child to grow up in, what they perceive as quote unquote a broken home.
All good points. We have just a few more. When the police respond and an individual is removed from the home, what takes place after that?
So if we respond to a family violence incident and we're removing someone from the home, that I'm assuming you're meaning that we've had probable cause to make an arrest. And one thing to point out is that in Connecticut, we are a mandatory arrest state when it comes to family violence incidences. So if we respond to a report of family violence and we establish probable cause, we are mandated to make an arrest of the offending party. It's not the victim pressing charges. Oftentimes, again, we'll respond to these incidences, and the person that has been abused has called us to the scene, but now they find out the offender is going to be arrested, and I don't want to press charges. There isn't that option when we talk about family violence. If we have probable cause as police, we're mandated to make the arrest. So post-arrest, if it's a custodial arrest and the person's coming back to the police department with us, we are going to do all our booking processing. Likely in a family violence situation where you're going to be setting a bond, and usually when there's violence in a domestic situation, we usually set a higher bond, but that doesn't mean that the individual will not be able to post bond, post arrest within hours after being processed, and then subsequently be released. So what do we tell victims? We give them the case number. If we do advise them to contact us as frequent as they would like to find out what the status is of the offender, if they have been released from our custody. We do, if they do post bond and are released with a next day court date, we will issue a conditions of release more often than not, which could be something as simple as do not harass, threaten, annoy the protected party, to something more what would be called more of a full contact, no contact, or do not contact, do not return to the residence. That arrested party would then have a next day court date. Typically arrests, we set court dates 10 to 14 days out, but with domestic violence situations, it's the next day court date. So if it's Monday through Friday, the arrest happens on Tuesday, they're going to be appearing in court on Wednesday, notwithstanding it being a holiday. And then at that time, at arraignment, the judge will typically issue a criminal protective order, which again could be something as simple as do not harass, threaten, annoy, or it could be more, full no contact order.
Okay, thank you. We have two more. So what if someone wants to help a friend or family they know, but has fears about causing Child Protective Services to remove the child from the household?
Do you want to take that, Georgette, or?
Can you repeat the question one more time? My Zoom isn't working, I think.
Right.
Well.
So if someone wants to help a friend or a family that they know, but has fears about causing Child Protective Services to remove the child from the household, what would you suggest?
Mm-hmm. I think that's even like sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
No, it's okay. Do you want me to?
Yes, I think absolutely. Go ahead. But I think it's also, I just want to validate that that's even a concern that sometimes providers have.
Yeah. Right?
That someone is sharing this information with you, but as providers, we're mandated reporters, and that it's a felony not to report when you have a suspicion of child abuse or neglect. As a friend, though, I think that the longer we stay quiet, the longer we sort of turn a blind eye to it, the more that we're sort of complicit in this idea that this is okay and this is the message that the child is getting, and the sheer impact of domestic violence on children is tremendous. That goes on for generations. So, Child Protective Services is there to really help the family, to put services in place, because we all know, like, no parent wakes up in the morning saying like that I want to harm my child. They don't. And so I think often the fear that children are going to be removed is very valid, very normal, but often unfounded. And that the risk to the child and to the person in the other adult in the home is far greater. And I think that there's a way of also working collaboratively with Child Protective Services so they can see all the protective factors that are there. They don't remove children sort of willy-nilly. They don't. They're there to support. Sarah.
That is very similar, Georgette, to what I was just going to comment on, that it's very unusual to have a child removed from the home. And that, as you said, it's really the last thing they want to do. They want to provide all of the services and resources and support to the family without having to do that.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. For the sake of time, although we only have one more question in the chat right now, I think it would be best to wrap up and just thank everyone for coming. And if anyone does feel the need or want to reach out to anyone on the panel with more specific questions or concerns, please feel free to do so, and we will help where we are able. So thank you everyone for coming. And yes, also if you haven't, please complete the program evaluation before leaving.